good morning and welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. And today we're going to begin the section of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, his code of law that deals with ethics. But before I begin, I just want to mention, and we'll connect it also to the fact that this Monday night is the beginning of a major Jewish holiday, the holiday of Sukkot, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And it ties in with what we're going to be discussing. So we're going to go into both Maimonides and the holiday. The first thing is that, as I mentioned in the earlier classes, Maimonides' major work, his magnum opus, was called the Mishnah Torah, the restatement of the Torah, where he gathers all of what his predecessors, going back to the Talmud, Midrash, and other classical Jewish works, have said about Jewish law and Jewish practice, and he consolidated all of them into one major work, which consists of 14 volumes. Each volume is subdivided into smaller sections. In effect, each volume is divided into smaller books, total of 83. The first book of the 14 is called the Book of Knowledge, and it's divided into 5 different smaller books. The first section, the first chapter of the first section of the Book of Knowledge deals with the fundamental teachings of Judaism, and he starts with the words, there's a commandment that we have to know God. Again, he uses the emphasis on the word knowing. And it's interesting, in his earlier work, which was an outline that he made for himself to write the Mishnah Torah, he uses a word which means to have faith in God, to believe in God. And there's a whole controversy about that, because why did he change from his earlier work to his later work? First he says to believe in God, and then he says to know God. So the consensus is that the book of the commandments, which he authored before the Mishnah Torah, was not written in Hebrew, it was written in Arabic. And the translator didn't get it right. Instead of, the translator took the word to know and he changed it to believe. And Maimonides was really consistent in that he felt that the commandment that we have is to know God. Now, how do you know God? You can't know God. You can know his attributes. You can know how he relates to the world. He relates to the world with kindness. He relates to the world with judgment. He relates to the world with compassion. Whatever relationship he has with the world, we're supposed to reflect on that and meditate on that. That's what he establishes in his very first section, the emphasis on knowledge. Yes, faith has its place in Judaism, obviously, but you can't command someone, the argument is, to have faith. Because if someone doesn't have faith, just because you commanded him, he says, well, who are you to command me? Well, God said so. Well, but I don't believe yet. If you want to convince me there's a God, you have to know, you have to reflect on it, you have to meditate on it, you have to examine the subject matter. So the Maimonides' first book is called the Book of Knowledge, and he begins that book with the commandment to know God. The second section, which is the one we're going to be doing, is the book of, they translate it as personality development. That's not what it says in the original. And I just want to make a comment about translations. You can't translate Hebrew into any other language accurately, precisely, because Hebrew is probably one of the shortest languages, has the least amount of words. So every word has so many nuances that if you translate it, even if it's an accurate translation, it's still imprecise because it doesn't give you the other nuances. English, on the other hand, is probably has more words than any other language. So especially if you're an English speaker, Hebrew becomes very elusive. The Hebrew word that is used for the personality development is deot. Deot is cognate to the word knowledge. So again, if you really want to translate it literally, it would be the laws of knowledge. But that's also not perfectly accurate, because we're not talking about knowledge over here, we're talking about personality development. That's what he's discussing. So I would translate it as the book of attitudes, because attitudes are based on your knowledge to a great extent. And Maimonides emphasizes the importance of knowledge. But what is the connection to the holiday, the upcoming holiday? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a sermon on the upcoming holiday. The upcoming holiday is called Sukkot. Sukkot, if you're Ashkenazic, if you're Sephardic, it's Sukkot. Different pronunciations of Hebrew. This holiday is the holiday of booths. We dwell in a sukkah, in a booth, in a temporary dwelling place covered with branches, and we stay in that for 7 days. And we celebrate the holiday for those 7 days with another precept, another commandment, to take 4 species, 4 different plants, and put them together and recite a blessing. What are these 4 plants? The etrog, which is a lemon-like citrus fruit, which grows in the Mediterranean area primarily, Israel included, Italy especially. That's the etrog. Then we take the lulav. It's a palm branch. Before the leaves start spreading out, we take this palm branch and we attach to it myrtle leaves and willows. These are 4 species that we gather together, and there are a lot of reasons given. What is the significance, what's the symbolism of these 4 species? And the sukkah, the sukkah which is covered with the branches, temporary dwelling place. There are many different symbolisms, and we can spend a year just focusing on the symbolisms in these 2 commandments. But one symbolism relates to the idea that the Jewish people, this is very parochial in a way, and it's very universal as well. On the holiday of Sukkot, we focus on the Jewish people, as we do in other holidays. We thank God when He took us out of Egypt, He gave us shelter. So it's a holiday in which we express, a Thanksgiving holiday, in which we express the idea that God provides us with shelter, with protection. And it's also a universal holiday, because during the 7 days of this holiday, in the days when we had the temple, they would bring 70 offerings, total of 70 offerings corresponding to the 70 biblical nations that are recorded in Genesis, from which all the other nations emerged. So the holiday is both focusing on the Jewish historical narrative, and it focuses as well on the universal. But when you talk about the parochial aspect of it, the Jewish aspect of it, it's connected to the holiday that precedes it. Yesterday we just observed Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It's the Day of Judgment. Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur, the days of judgment. Now when you're judged, you don't know if you won the case or you didn't win the case. How do you know if you win the case? So the Midrash, which is a collection of Talmudic sages commenting on the Bible, explain that when you come out of the courthouse carrying a scepter, which in ancient times was a symbol of victory, you knew you won the case. So taking the lulav is a symbol of victory, that we won our case and we will be given a good year. But it also, by extension, means the Jewish people have gone through, and they're still going through, threats to their very existence, and there's always a chance that we could see, God forbid, the design of our anti-Semitic enemies coming to fruition, the destruction of the Jewish people. So on this holiday, we take the lulav, the palm branch, which resembles a scepter, and we say, we are victorious, we're going to prevail, we're going to survive. And this is a basic principle Maimonides considers the immortality of the Jewish nation to be a very fundamental principle of faith, that the Jewish people will always exist, they will never disappear. That's a guarantee that the Torah gives us, as Maimonides records that. How do you symbolize, and what's the key to the survival of the Jewish people? So there are 5 things. One of them is represented by the 4 species, and the 5th is by the sukkah. So let's go through the 4 species, and the sukkah will be the one connected to what we're learning in Maimonides. with a focus on knowledge. One of the four, as I mentioned, is the etrog, a lemon-like fruit. It resembles the heart. The heart represents the emphasis, and not only emphasis, but the obsession that the Jewish people had with acts of kindness. If you look at the movements in modern times, as in ancient times, movements to help humanity, there's always a disproportionate number of Jewish people involved in those movements. I remember growing up in Buffalo, when I first came here, I was on the campus of UB. Some of you probably remember the campus of UB. And the Norton Union, there were tables there for different groups. Most of the groups that were devoted to changing the world, I'm not saying that I agree with it, their method of changing the world, some of them were communist groups, but most of them were disproportionately manned by Jews. And they were motivated, we have to change the world, we have to help humanity, and that has been true throughout Jewish history. So if not for the Jewish heart, we would not have survived. The degree to which we went out of our way to help our fellow is legendary. Then we have the Lulav, the palm branch, which resembles the spine. That's Jewish stubbornness. You know, the Bible describes the Jews as a stiff-necked people. Well, that's taken as a praise, as a compliment, not as a criticism only. The fact that we are stiff-necked, that we are stubborn, we are persistent, we don't give up, no matter what. They knock us down, we bounce back. The Holocaust was the greatest, the most devastating destruction of a nation in history. And yet, a few years after the Holocaust, the Jewish people bounced back, and not only bounced back to the way they were before, they thrived and flourished even more. If not for that stiff-neckedness, if not for that tenacity, if not for that perseverance, we wouldn't be here today. Then we have the myrtles. The myrtles resemble the eye. The eye symbolizes the way you look at life. You look at it as a pessimist looks at everything, or as an optimist. You see the good, you see the positive for the future. And if we wouldn't have that positive view, we're realists. We're not starry-eyed optimists who don't recognize what's going on. We're very much aware of all the problems. We're very much aware of all the negatives, but we still persist in our positive view of things. And if not for that positive view, we would have surrendered to the persecution, we would have surrendered to the realities of existence, and we would have disappeared. Then we have the willows. The willows resemble the mouth, the Jewish skill of communicating. Judaism is based on communicating. People think that a rabbi is a teacher. That's only partially true, because according to Jewish law, every Jew has an obligation to be a teacher, not just a rabbi. It just so happens the rabbi gets paid for it. You know, I'll throw in this joke. This man comes to the rabbi and he says, "Rabbi, my son has gone crazy." He says, "What do you mean he's gone crazy?" He's starting to observe all the laws of Judaism. He's keeping kosher. He's observing the Sabbath. And he's praying 3 times a day. So the rabbi says, "I do the same thing." He says, "Yeah, Rabbi, you get paid for it. He really means it." So every Jew is obligated to be a rabbi in a sense of being a teacher. If you know the A of Judaism, and there's another person who doesn't know the A, you have an obligation to share that A with him, or the B and the C, and so on and so forth. If we didn't have that ability, and most of Judaism, and this very much ties in with Maimonides, most of Judaism is not biblical. It's biblical in terms of its foundation, but if not for the oral traditions that were later on preserved in the Talmud and other classical works, we wouldn't be here today. It's the transmission, the oral transmission. People ask, why wasn't it all written down? Because if it was written down, it would not have survived, ironically. Because anything that's written, you just go to the library, and anyone says, well, I can go to the library and I could read my books and I'll know what to do. The answer to that is that if you don't transmit it orally, there's no link between one generation and another, and something gets lost. The same text could be interpreted 10,000 different ways. So when you write something down, it more or less limits it. But without going more into detail about the oral law, that's a fact of life that Judaism is preserved because we have the skill of communicating. Parents taught their children, teachers taught thousands of students. There were thousands of teachers. We don't even know the number of rabbis in the Talmudic period, probably the tens of thousands, because everyone has that obligation. So you have those four different elements, are the heart, the spine, the eyes, and the mouth. But then there's a fifth one. The fifth one is the brain, Jewish pursuit of knowledge. And what is the symbolism of the sukkah? You have to go to the Bible. It tells you that you dwell in the sukkah for 7 days so that people will know, future generations will know, underlying the word know, that God says I put you in these dwelling places when you left Egypt. The focus of looking at the covering of the sukkah is to instill knowledge. If not for the focus, the emphasis, the obsession with knowledge, again, we wouldn't be here today. Why is it that a disproportionate of people who won the Nobel Prizes have been Jewish? The Jews are not smarter genetically than anyone else necessarily. It's hard to say that Jews have a brain that others don't have, but it's because the obsession with knowledge, and that's what Maimonides stands for, and that's why he calls his first book the Book of Knowledge, and the second section, which doesn't talk about knowledge, you would think, he also calls it the Book of Attitudes in terms of personality development. Okay, so let's get started. Before every subsection, Maimonides prefaces it with a list of the commandments that he's going to discuss. Remember, we discussed that there are 613 commandments, and Maimonides, in several of his works, enumerates all the 613. In the Mishnah Torah, in his introduction to the whole Mishnah Torah, he repeats that list twice, and then here goes through it a third time. In each section, he focuses on those commandments that are germane to this section. So he writes as follows: included in this text are 11 mitzvot, 11 commandments, 5 positive commandments, and 6 negative commandments. What he means by positive and negative is 5 commandments that we have to do, and 5 prohibitions, things that we're not allowed to do. And they comprise the following. So he gives the list of these 10 commandments. Number 1, to imitate his ways. His is God, it's capitalized. We have a commandment to emulate God. There's a Latin word that describes this commandment, imitatio Dei, imitating God. Now, the uniqueness of Maimonides when he talks about imitating God, why do we want to imitate God? Because the only way we could become godly, we can't become godly because we're humans. So how could we become God? But by imitating his ways, we become godly. And the way to become godly is to look in the Torah, in the Bible, and see what God does. So what do you read in the beginning of Genesis? God provides Adam and Eve with clothing. So that tells you if you want to be godly, you have to help other people clothe themselves. What do we see later on? That Abraham is ailing because of the circumcision of self-circumcision, and God comes and appears to him. He visits the sick. Then he buries Moses. I'm going through the Bible very quickly from the beginning to the end, but you go through the Bible and you see how God behaves. So we have a commandment to imitate God. That's how we become godly. But that's not enough. The Torah says you're supposed to cling to God. How can you cling to God? God is not a physical being. And the answer is to cling to those who know him. There are people who focus their attention on knowing God, on spiritual people. So when you get close to those people, in whichever way possible, you study under them, you associate with them, you do business with them, Maimonides will say later, you marry into their families. In other words, by association with other humans, you become like them. It's by osmosis. Then we have the third one, to love others. That's not a good translation. The Torah doesn't say you should love others as yourself. What it says, and it can't be translated very well, the most common translation is, love your neighbor as yourself. No such phrase exists in the Bible, neighbor. I don't even know if the word neighbor ever appears in the Bible. It probably does, but I can't think of it. Certainly not in this context. The Hebrew word that's used is re'acha, which the best way of translating it would mean your friend or your fellow. I like the translation of your fellow because it is a more general way of translating it rather than getting very specific, which would not be accurate. But it certainly does not say to love others. This commandment is, according to Maimonides, which is based on the Talmud, was focused on your relationship with your fellow Jew. Later, years later, Hillel, the great Talmudic sage, introduced the idea of loving everyone. Now, we're going to go into this later on when we get to that section where Maimonides discusses it, but I just want to make it very clear that this commandment to love your fellow as yourself is virtually impossible to fulfill. To really love someone the way you love yourself. Sure. The only way you could fulfill it is in a practical sense, to do things for others the way you would do for yourself. Or, as the Talmud phrases it, don't do things to others that you wouldn't want others to do to you. In other words, you're able to love someone behaviorally the way you love yourself, but emotionally, that's a very tall order. That might be the ultimate goal. If that's the ultimate goal, you have to be very realistic about it, that it can only be commanded to someone who is really close to you, and the Torah focuses on the relationship we have with our fellow Jewish person. But by extension, the law, the need to love everyone is there as well. But if you don't love your own intensely, just to give an example, there are people who want to save the world and they talk about love, but they don't get along with their own spouse or their own children. If you can't get along with your own loved ones, we call them loved ones, and you don't love your loved ones, how are you going to save the world? You have to first focus. An analogy given is that when you want to heat a skyscraper, the boiler is in the basement. If the boiler room is just as hot as the upper floors, it's not going to heat the upper floors. You want the boiler room to be very, very hot so that it could extend, some of the heat will extend to the whole world. If you want to really save the world, focus first on those who are closest to you, and then you add a little bit more to those outside of your circle, and little by little the whole world changes. But we'll get more into that when we get to that section. Then there's another commandment to love converts. If someone converts to Judaism, you have a special commandment to love the convert, and the question is asked, well, once he converts to Judaism, he is just the same as you. So why do you need a separate commandment? So it's obvious, and we'll get more into that when we get to that point, that there's a certain tendency that people, and it's wrong, but some people do not treat outsiders the way they treat insiders. So if an outsider comes and becomes an insider, you might say, I don't have to really have the same devotion to that person. So the Torah says, no, you must love the convert. Now, this doesn't mean that we seek converts. One of the distinctive elements of Judaism is that we don't encourage conversion to Judaism. If someone wants to convert, it's a very difficult process. They have to really prove their sincerity. Once they're accepted and embraced, then they are treated as they are, just as if they were born in the Jewish tradition. And in fact, Maimonides has a letter that he's known for, and it exhibits his very powerful heart. A convert to Judaism wrote him a letter saying that he was taunted by other Jews. And what was he taunted about? In the prayers, we make reference to the patriarchs. We are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It says, you can't say those words in your prayers because you're not a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Maimonides goes through a lengthy legalistic discussion about the text of the prayers, And then he concludes the letter with the following. It says, while we, born Jews, trace ourselves to God through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through our patriarchs, you have a direct link to the Creator. In other words, you're superior to us because we have to trace, where did we get our Judaism from? From our parents, and they from their parents. It's not something that we chose on our own. We were born into it. You chose this, so you're superior to us. So the love of a convert is to underscore that contrary to what you might think, the convert is inferior. No, he's not inferior. You have to love him because he's one of yours, and you have to love him even more. Then there's another commandment, a negative, not to hate one's fellow Jews. Now, the way this commandment is understood is that if you have some complaint against your fellow, don't keep it in your heart. Either you forgive the person or you confront the person. Don't harbor any hatred in your heart. And that's why that ties in with the next commandment, to admonish a wrongdoer. If you see someone did something wrong, then you have an obligation to admonish them. Now, if they did it to you personally, you can always forgive them and just erase it. You don't have to let them live in your mind rent-free, that you're always thinking about them. Get rid of the thought, but you either have to forgive him or her, or you confront them and say, look, this is what you did, whether it's to you or it's to someone else or it's to God, and you rebuke them. Now, there are parameters. How far do you have to go in rebuking? What happens if the guy starts shouting at you and cursing you because you mind your own business? Do you have to go to the extreme? No, you don't have to go to extremes, but that Maimonides will discuss in detail. But then when you rebuke someone, it's very often you embarrass the person. So you have a commandment not to shame someone. That this is a commandment that relates specifically to admonishing someone as well as in general. And embarrassing someone is considered to be a very egregious sin. You know, it says in the Torah, when the Ten Commandments, actually, do not kill, do not commit murder. Most of us here have not committed murder. Okay. And we don't expect that to happen anytime in the near future, thank God. Most civilized human beings will not commit murder. So that means that commandment is irrelevant to most people. Because the person who's thinking about committing murder doesn't care what it says in the Ten Commandments. So to whom is it directed? To most of us, we don't need it. To the one who it isn't needed, doesn't care about it. And one of the answers to that question is that it's another way of saying don't embarrass another person. And the Talmud describes that when you embarrass someone, the blood leaves the face and you turn white and then you turn red again. That's another way of bloodshed. When you embarrass someone, you're actually physiologically causing your blood to be transferred from your face outside of your face. It's a form of bloodshed, but the deeper understanding of it is when you embarrass someone, you're destroying their dignity, you're destroying their humanity. So we have a commandment that even when you're rebuking someone, and justifiably so, you should try to do it in a way where you don't embarrass them. You do it quietly, you do it in a nice way, in a meaning way, in a compassionate way. Then we have a commandment not to oppress the unfortunate. Who are the unfortunate? They refer specifically to widows and orphans. That's how it's phrased in the Bible. Widows and orphans. But by extension, it applies to anyone who's in a position of being unfortunate. Why would you need a commandment for that? You shouldn't oppress anyone, even if they're not unfortunate. Even if they're a multi-billionaire, you shouldn't oppress them for no good reason. But it means to emphasize, since these people are generally speaking they don't hold important positions in the hierarchy of humanity. These are people who are not very powerful. People might take advantage of them. It's a tendency that people take advantage of weak people. So the commandment, the Torah says, no, don't take advantage. Then there's another commandment. This is a very difficult one to fulfill. It's not to gossip, which means not to go around from person to person, telling, did you hear what happened to Joe? Did you hear what happened to Mary? Did you hear what? But I heard about this person going around gossiping. It raises a question, what about the media? Isn't the media just gossip? So it tells you that maybe some of the media, we shouldn't be so excited about tuning into that media. Then we have not to take revenge. Not taking revenge. Someone harmed you, so what you do is either you rebuke them, or you forgive them, you bring them to justice if it's actionable in a court, but you don't take revenge. Now, there's a difference between revenge and defense. If someone attacks you and they're likely to attack you again, you have a right to defend yourself, but that's not revenge. And I think that's what's going on with Israel today. People mistake the idea of revenge with defense. If someone attacks you, you don't take revenge, but if there's a threat that they might repeat the attack, you have to defend yourself. And actually, when the Torah says don't kill, the sixth commandment, it doesn't really say that, don't kill. It says don't commit murder. And murder is defined by the Torah as killing an innocent person. But if you're killing in self-defense, then the defense of other innocent people, that is not considered murder. And that actually happens to be one of the 613 commandments, that you do defend someone who's in danger. Then we have not to bear a grudge. The Talmud gives an illustration of revenge and an illustration of bearing a grudge. Revenge means, I'll have to make it relevant to Buffalo. It's snowing, and your neighbor has a snowblower. So you ask your neighbor, could you lend me your snowblower? And he says, no, I won't. A year later, you buy a snowblower, and your neighbor's isn't working, so he comes to you, and he says, can I borrow your snowblower? And you tell him, you didn't lend it to me last year, I'm not going to lend it to you this year. That's revenge. What's bearing a grudge? Bearing a grudge is the same scenario where he comes to you the year later, and you tell him, you know what, you didn't lend me your snowblower when I needed it, but I will lend my snowblower to you because I'm better than you. That's good. That's bearing a grudge. Just forget about it. Again, if you feel that the person wronged you by not lending you the snowblower, then confront the person and say, I thought it was wrong on your part that you wouldn't lend it to me, and or forget it. But don't keep the grudge. These mitzvot, these commandments, are explained in the following chapters. So Maimonides is going to go through 7 chapters in which he's going to discuss all of these 11 commandments. That's how he does it for all the 83 sections of the Mishnah Torah. He gives you a list of the commandments that are going to be discussed, that are all grouped together because they have a common theme, and then he goes through them. So this is the one where he's discussing what is known in philosophical language and also popularly as the golden mean. The golden mean is the middle of the road. Don't go to extremes. That's a principle that Aristotle talks about, and others even before Aristotle, but Aristotle was one who really promoted it, about not going to extremes, that there are extremes in all different traits. You can go to one extreme or the other. The best approach is to go to the middle of the road. Maimonides is not just quoting Aristotle. Maimonides gives it a Jewish twist and puts it in the context of the commandments of the Torah. But before he goes into the commandments, he first illustrates the different personality types that people have that are different extremes. So we'll start off with chapter 1. We don't have much time, but we'll just start off. Each and every man possesses many character traits. What about women? Maimonides doesn't write man. That's the translator. Because in Hebrew, there is no neuter. It's either male or female. So when you have something that's neither male or female, the Hebrew uses the masculine form, not because it relates only to men. Now, there are certain parts of Jewish practice that are relevant to men and certain that are relevant to women. Then it's spelled out. But here it just means person. I would have translated it each and every person possesses many character traits, but these are old translations, and this is the way they used to translate it. So every one of us possesses many character traits. We're not monolithic beings. We have many different traits. And now he's going to go on to show how these traits could go from one extreme to another. One type of person is wrathful, constantly angry. We know people like that. They're not easy to get along with, people who are always angry. In contrast, the brackets are added by the translator. So it's assumed that Maimonides assumed you would put that in there. In contrast, there is the calm individual who is never moved to anger. Before we go any further, or if at all, he will be slightly angry, perhaps once during a period of several years. So we have these two extremes, someone who's always angry and someone who hardly ever gets angry. As you can imagine, Maimonides is going to say both extremes are bad. Both extremes are undesirable. You don't want someone who's always angry, and you don't want someone who never gets upset about anything. What does that demonstrate? That there's something missing in their personality. It's a personality flaw. Then he gives another example. I think he's going to give about 5 examples of different traits. There is the prideful person. One is always arrogant, haughty, and the one who's exceptionally humble. That might also be a personality flaw, because being humble is a very positive thing, but when you're exceptionally humble, you let everyone step over you. You have no backbone. You have no real personality. You don't stand for anything because everyone can step on you. You're meek and weak. So Maimonides is making it sound that those are personality flaws. Obviously, the one who is arrogant, has a big ego, is negative, because he steps over everyone else, and the one who is exceptionally humble. There was this egotist who came to his rabbi and he said, when I come to the synagogue, everyone steps on me. So the rabbi says, because you spread yourself out, you cover the whole area, that there's no other place for them to step except on you. So if you'd be a little bit more humble, if you'd leave a little room for others, they would have room to step and they wouldn't have to step on you. So the person who's the egotist, who spreads himself out throughout the whole area, is negative, and the one who is so meek that he doesn't have any, that occupies no area, is also emotionally negative. Later on, we're going to see Maimonides makes a U-turn, and this is Maimonides' interesting approach to many things. He'll tell you something, a chapter later he'll reverse himself slightly, not totally, but slightly, because he does advocate extremes sometimes in humility. It's not being a negative, but that's not a personality imperative. A personality imperative that a person has to have some ego. If you don't have any ego, there's something wrong with you. Then there's a man or person ruled by his appetites. He will never be satisfied from pursuing his desires. Someone who is always looking for more satisfaction from physical things. It could be money, it could be food, it could be any other type of desire. And then, conversely, there's the very pure of heart, who does not desire even the little that the body needs. Person who doesn't ask for anything and deprives himself. That's not healthy. So these two extremes, we assume, are not positive. We'll go through another paragraph or two, if it's all right with everyone. There is the greedy person who cannot be satisfied with all the money in the world. This is something specifically with regard to money, as it says in Ecclesiastes, King Solomon, a lover of money never has his fill of money. The Hebrew word for money there, I believe, is kesef, which is really silver, but it's another way of saying money. In contrast, there is a person who puts a check on himself. He is satisfied with even a little, which is not enough for his needs, and he does not bother to pursue and attain what he lacks. There's an expression in the Talmud, a person who has $100, rubles, shekels, whatever denomination you want, it works. If you have 100, how much do you want? 200. When you get 200, how much do you want? 400. It keeps on growing exponentially. It's not if you have 100, you want 200, then you want 300, then you want 400. It grows from 200 to 400, 400 to 800. That's the vice of the desire for money. A person who's in that extreme is obviously negative. A person will never be happy. But a person who doesn't even care for a little bit is going to deprive himself. That would be a negative as well. Then there's the miser who torments himself with hunger, gathering his possessions close to himself. Whenever he spends a penny of his own, he does so with great pain. He doesn't even care about himself. This is the opposite. Person who doesn't care of it. Conversely, there is the spendthrift who consciously wastes his entire fortune. So all other traits follow the same pattern of contrast. For example, the overly elated person is always happy, happy-go-lucky, and the depressed, the stingy, and the free-handed. Someone who wouldn't part with a penny for someone else, and someone who gives everything away. Then there's the cruel and the soft-hearted, the coward and the rash. Rash, someone who just puts himself in danger needlessly, not heroically, but frivolously, and the like. So we have these two extremes. And between each trait and the contrasting trait at the other extreme, there are intermediate points, each distant from the other. In other words, there's no midpoint. There is a whole spectrum of intermediate points, a whole spectrum. And in some cases, the best approach is to be at one point in that spectrum. In some cases, it's better to be at a different point. It's not always that if it's a scale of 1 to 100, it's always good to be 50. It depends on the situation. In some cases, it's good to be 10. Other cases, it's good to be 90. But it's always at a midpoint, never at the extremes, except in exceptional cases, and that he'll go into later. Okay, we'll stop over here. If there are any questions? Yes?
I'm going back to the first page. Could you explain, you said it was very difficult to convert to Judaism.
Right.
So what's involved in making, what's required of a person to convert? And then I've always heard that you were only a Jew if your mother was a Jew.
By Jewish identity is determined by the mother. That's definitely true. Or by conversion. But in order to convert, there are certain conditions. Number one, the person has to be prepared to accept Judaism, the beliefs of Judaism and the practices of Judaism. If they want to become Jewish because of some other reason, ulterior motive, then that's not a good reason to become Jewish, and the rabbi will try to turn you off to it. So that's essentially what it is. A person has to want to be part of the Jewish people with all their responsibilities and want to be part of the Jewish people. It's not just to God, it's also to your fellow, to share in their joys, to share in their sorrows. It's only natural for a Jew who was born Jewish to feel pain when he hears of a terrorist attack that just happened in Manchester yesterday. But with someone who isn't Jewish, I don't expect them to feel the same pain because it's not their relative. Although we feel pain when any innocent person gets killed, it's not the same thing when it's someone who's close to us. The convert has to feel that pain as well, because once he converts, he or she is part of the people, no less so than someone who was born Jewish. So if someone comes to the rabbi is going to turn them away and try to talk them out of it, of becoming Jewish. Why do you want to be Jewish? You want to be the subject of anti-Semitism? You want to go through all the bad things? No, there are many good things, but you have to balance that. And I've had cases where I talked them out of it, and some cases where I couldn't talk them out of it, and they converted. So it depends on each situation.